The war in Ukraine is still raging. Russia says that Kiev's counteroffensive has not gained much, while Ukraine is boasting of what it calls taking the war to Russia. More and more drone attacks are being conducted on the Russian capital, as well as targets in the Black Sea recently. Now, Russia, of course, saying it's shot down most of the drones and missiles. The most recent attacks focusing on Russian-controlled Donbas region, and on the other side, Ukrainian facilities in Kharkiv and Zaprorizhzhia. Stay with us for a discussion of the Ukraine-Russia war in this episode of The Spotlight. Let me introduce our guests. John Bosnich, journalist, activist, and political analyst, is joining me from Belgrade. Also with us today is Scott Bennett. He's a political commentator out of San Francisco. Okay, good to see you, gentlemen. Beginning with John Bosnich, you know, Kiev is claiming that its drones have put a Russian Black Sea fleet vessel out of action in such a way it's no more able to perform combat missions. You know, on Thursday night, at least 10 attacks using drone boats were reportedly conducted in the Black Sea, and they targeted Russian military ships. I want to ask you, how significant do you think this could be?
Well, every stage of the elevation of the level of the conflict is, of course, going to create new challenges, but we know from past experience until this stage that Russia has been able to respond more quickly on the field and in the air and on the water than Ukraine, because Russia is producing its own equipment, Russia is producing its own responses, and Russia is dominating the drone war already.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Scott, the Ukrainian Navy, some people say that because the Navy is not powerful enough to challenge the Russian military, still their drones are relatively cheap, they're accessible and effective, and they could provide a relatively fast and low-profile threat to Russian military ships, particularly when such attacks happen overnight. Now, could the use of drones prove to be a game changer in the war?
No, not at all. They're more like annoying flies that may cause irritating bites, but when you find the nest and destroy it, you destroy the flies. And I think Russia is adapting its countermeasures to do exactly that. So they have been annoyed by drones slamming into financial districts in Moscow. They have been annoyed by cluster bombs being shelled on civilian areas and sea drones, ramming into ships. But Russia's been prepared for that, and they've, as your previous guest said, they have been producing far superior weaponry in far superior numbers, superior tanks, hypersonic missiles, a morally inspired military, full spectrum dominance on the information field, on the surveillance field, on the satellite field. Mm-hmm. They have far superior weapons, and they've been fighting this in a defensive way in order to win the diplomatic soft power of the majority of the world's nations. So there's a kinetic aspect, which you see the Ukrainian army dropping from 500,000 to 43,000 men, many of whom don't want to serve. Many of them are defecting because they've seen so many soldiers in Ukraine having their organs cut out for the black market organ harvesting that the U.S. has also been doing. There's also the moral component of the biochemical labs, which the United States had in Ukraine. So the kinetic factors, the moral factors, the international diplomatic soft power war is all going towards Russia's column. And the overall support of the world, I think, is on Russia's side and not with Ukraine or America, because we're witnessing the hypocrisy and the underlining evil that has animated this U.S.-Ukraine proxy war, which has been nothing but genocide.
All right, now, John, let's take a look at another aspect of this war. Russian officials saying that Ukraine has hit the Donetsk University building using cluster shells, and that has caused widespread damage. And Kiev had promised, when receiving this aid, not to use this Western-provided cluster munitions inside Russian soil and against civilians. So why doesn't the U.S. make an objection to Kiev that's using these weapons that are banned by more than 120 countries?
I hope you're joking, because the United States doesn't care what the world thinks at all. The United States is using the conflict in Ukraine to set brother against brother. This is the old role that the English used to play around the world. Gandhi once said that if you want to know where the British have been, where the English have been in particular, you can go far, far out of the city into the forest and find a little stream. And if you find two brother fish at each other's throats, you know the English have been there. And that's what the Americans have inherited from England, their colonial founders. And that's what they're doing now. And they're trying to make a war between the Ukrainian people and the Russian people that will make them hate each other forever. And among that hate environment, the Americans would like to place their nuclear weapons, their hydrogen bombs, their attack-oriented weaponry to destroy the Russian Federation. That's the real story of what's happening here. And that's why the Russian army is moving so slowly. That's why the Russian army is trying everything it can to avoid civilian casualties and to minimize the number of Ukrainians who are killed. Basically, the Ukrainians who are being killed in this war are the fanatical neo-Nazis and the men under their command who are being driven from behind by their officers with guns at their backs to die on the tank traps and the barbed wire that Russia has put up to defend the civilian population of ethnic Russians in Ukraine.
I see. Now, Scott, let's talk about peace now. Saudi Arabia, as you may know, has hosted this peace conference on the Ukraine war. There were representatives from around 40 countries like Brazil, the UK, India, China, the US, Turkey, South Africa. Also, some EU countries were also in attendance. Everyone except Russia. So my first question is, why should Russia be excluded?
Well, I think Russia is aware that Saudi Arabia is doing this on its with the permission of Russia. Saudi Arabia isn't just doing this as a countermeasure to jeopardize its relationship or turn cold its warming opportunities with Russia. I think Saudi Arabia made full secret diplomatic connections with Russia and said, we would like to try and step in and see what we can cultivate with Ukraine. And Russia said, yes, go ahead. We're happy to do that. Russia isn't obsessive or narcissistic settling of this. They have their absolute values and requirements, and they're not going to budge on those because they've set their requirements as, we need the following done in order to preserve our people, our culture, and this is an existential threat. No nuclear weapons in Ukraine, no biochemical weapons in Ukraine, no NATO membership in Ukraine, and no Nazi regime in Ukraine, period. End of story. Until that's done, we're going to have to chop down the grass until it's left as nothing but a desert oblivion. So Saudi Arabia stepping in, I think, is actually going to try and persuade Ukraine to adopt Russia's more than gracious offerings that they did last spring in order to preserve their life. But knowing the Ukrainian Zelensky U.S. puppet, the Biden administration, which your guest previously said is very right. The Americans don't care about a Ukrainian. They want to annihilate the entire country if they think it can hurt Russia in one small way. Well, that's the weak point, because Russia can advertise that in a soft war, propaganda, psychological war, and advertise to the entire population, the West is using you, brutalizing you, organ harvesting you, and destroying you for its own purposes. Come back and let brother and brother seek amends, seek a peaceful collaboration, and you need a third party to do that. Now, an interesting thing would be if Iran stepped in and added to this peace negotiation alongside Saudi Arabia, because Iran is very solidly, I think, on Russia's side. Russia knows that. And Saudi Arabia would be forced to soften any of its requirements if Iran was part of it. So this is a multipolar world, soft power diplomatic settlement that's in process.
Okay. Now, John, regarding this Saudi initiative, the press agents there has announced that mainly national security advisors were participating in the consultations, that Riyadh hopes would come up with peaceful ways to resolve the war in Ukraine. Do you expect this Saudi initiative to be a success, or is it going to be a non-starter?
Well, it's definitely not a non-starter. It's already started. I mean, that's point number one. And I think that I agree he's exactly on the mark here, that there is no chance whatsoever that Saudi Arabia, after its warming of relations with Russia and after its contact with Iran recently, is going to start trying unilaterally to intervene in this affair. So Russia has already set the line in the sand that the ethnic Russian population of Ukraine is not going back to Ukraine. They have been annexed. They are a part proper of Russia, and that is non-negotiable. So by allowing Saudi Arabia to begin some preliminary pre-negotiations, Saudi Arabia can deliver that very message, that under no circumstances is there any chance whatsoever of the annexed territory of Russia being returned to Ukraine as some sort of a gift, as it was given in the past. We know that Crimea was gifted to Ukraine. That kind of mistake, that kind of naivete has been shattered by the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, by Zelensky's puppet operation under US control, and by the gung-ho attitude of NATO, who just wants another war to drive their economies, which are all failing. Those are all non-starters. Saudi Arabia is delivering the message. And I do agree with your other guest that this is an opportunity for Iran, which has excellent ties with Russia, which has excellent ties with China, to also join in bringing the stubborn, close-minded, and extremist Ukrainians to the peace table, because they're either going to get bombed there or they're going to get convinced to go there.
Okay. Now, Scott, let's, speaking of peace, let's look at the two conflicting sides. Demands Zelensky, for instance, proposed a 10-clause peace plan in November 2022. It includes mutual exchange of prisoners, ensuring nuclear, food, and energy security, withdrawal of all Russian forces from Ukraine, and the restoration of the complete territorial integrity of this country. Your assessment of the plan, is it logical and feasible?
No, it's fanatical, it's delusional, it's emotionally schizophrenic, and that's exactly what the West, American specific, has become. And your other guest has said it well. Not one inch of Russian territory is going to be returned to Ukraine, because we've seen Ukrainians do to the eastern Ukrainians, the Russians. They torture them, they organ harvest them, they do horrific acts of torture, crimes against humanity. They're taught to do this by the Mossad. They're taught to do this by the CIA. They're given drugs by the U.S., methamphetamines and ecstasy and things that animate them into zombie-like soldiers. That's a reality. So no part of Ukraine is going to be returned to Russia. And why should they? Because Russia's already been lied to by the Minsk agreements, by Germany, by France. So there's nothing the U.S. or Germany or France or NATO can say to Russia that can be relied upon. And I think Russia also recognizes that NATO as a whole is a paper tiger. It has 600 tanks. Russia has 900. Russia has hypersonic missiles. It has nuclear torpedoes that'll travel around the world. It has far superior technology and weapons than the West have, because they make weapons to defend their people and their culture. The West makes weapons to enrich the military-industrial complex. And I think you're witnessing also a very dangerous situation that may develop as a false flag, where Joe Biden, the zombified American president, who's a coup d'etat against President Trump, Joe Biden most likely is going to allow a black flag, false flag event in Zaprorizhzhia, the nuclear plant, or somewhere else, perhaps in the United States, and blame Russia for that in order to try and initiate a draft and a larger war. But I think it'll fail.
IAEA chief was there, and he spoke of existence of no explosive in that infrastructure. Anyway, now, John, talking of peace, President Zelensky is also calling for security guarantees for Ukraine and the creation of an international mechanism to compensate for his country's financial losses, and that by using Russian assets. Your take?
Absurd. Absurd. The war started in 2014. That's point number one. That was when the United States admittedly at their own admission, said that they spent $5 billion, that's just the publicly released data, to stage a coup d'etat, to illegally, by force of violence, overthrow the legally elected president of Ukraine. In so doing, they kicked off a war that was running for 8 full years before Russia even entered the war. Then Russia tried to protect the people who were being subjected to genocide. And let me tell you, genocide is nothing new for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians killed 200,000 Jews after World War I. Then they killed 250,000 Poles between the two wars. Ukrainians have been committing genocide since before the word genocide was invented. This is a nation which has been misled and which has been deceived into thinking that they have nothing to do with Russia, their closest blood brothers. They are victims of their colonizers. They are victims of the West, and they are victims of the American military-industrial complex that has a bunch of garbage weapons that they need to have destroyed. And I can tell you one thing, Russia is going to destroy those weapons. And when those weapons are destroyed, the US taxpayer is going to see a bill in the trillions to replace them, because that's the only thing driving the US economy. So Russia and Ukraine are at war now because the United States does not know how to make money anymore. They can't compete with China. They can't compete militarily with Russia. So they send the Ukrainians to die en masse to fill their pockets full of blood money. That's what's happening here. And anybody who says differently is either being paid by the United States or simply has an extremely low IQ.
Okay. Now, Scott, let's look at the other side. We talked about Zelensky's demands. Now, on the other side, we have Russian President Putin saying in this recent meeting where he had got together African leaders in St. Petersburg, talking about grain deal and all that, that his country is ready for dialogue. As long as Ukraine is fighting, Russia cannot sit idle by and watch. They have to fight. That's what Putin said. But he said that he's there for dialogue if, for instance, Africa or China does the mediation. So given all what we've said so far, Zelensky's conditions and the war and all that's going on, what's the prospect of peace?
Well, the peace will come when Russia has annihilated Zelensky, either in his mansion in Florida or in Kiev or wherever he may be, along with his Nazi fanatics. That's when Russia will establish peace. They cannot establish peace where Zelensky remains alive or his regime remains in power, because then that cancer will grow as it did in the Minsk agreements. So Russia is going to be annihilating this echelon of leadership, and to try and do a cleansing of the leprosy and the gangrene that has infected the body politic of Ukraine. And I think the diplomatic efforts of Africa, of Saudi Arabia, hopefully of Iran, since Iranians, the Persians are far more intelligent when it comes to these sort of historical diplomatic engagements than many of the rest of the world. They're an ancient culture. And I think Iran could step in and do some magnificent diplomatic overtures to Zelensky and the regime to say, pack up your bags and leave, and you'll be alive. Don't do it, and you'll be dead, as will your entire progeny. So there won't be any peace until Russia decides that the conditions warrant peace. Because again, remember, Russia sees this, and the world begins to see this as a existential battle for the world. If Ukraine falls to the U.S. Imperialism, then they will use that as a platform to attack Russia. When Russia goes into breakup, then they'll attack Iran and China. So the world has to stand against this hegemonic empire.
Now, John, the West support is going on despite their own issues on home turf. Is it really worth all the trouble? And when it comes to the U.S., does the U.S. really want peace, or it wants the war to go on? How much longer is it going to help Kiev with ammo and military hardware, despite all the issues it has back home?
In the United States, it's no longer possible to refer to God. If you mention God, you're violating the Constitution. Yet it still says, "In God we trust," on their dollar bill. And that is their God. Mammon is the God of the United States. They do not care how many people die. They do not even care how many Americans die. They sent thousands and thousands of hundreds of thousands of Americans into Vietnam. 55,000 Americans died there with no result, except for the fact that the military-industrial complex had a war for 15 years in which everything they could make was being sold, and everybody who could work for them was making a salary, and the owners of the military-industrial complex and the banksters who run the U.S. political system, who buy the candidates, who set the agenda, were making themselves richer and richer. That's what America wants. The idea that America is doing anything today out of altruism, out of idealism, is so passé that I'd have to ask if the person is in a sleeping chamber from 100 years ago. There is no idea in Washington about doing something good for Ukraine. What they're doing is they're attacking Russia and using the Ukrainian people as a bloody battering ram.
All right, Scott, there are some analysts, observers, many of them calling this a war of attrition that would not end as long as the West keeps pouring in weaponry into Ukraine. Your opinion on that? We have only 1 minute left.
Well, the weaponry will be basically unmanned because all the Ukrainians are going to be dead or shattered and unable to manage it, or they will be refusing to pick up and use those arms. That's the level this is approaching, the complete disintegration and disintegration of the Ukrainian army. Now, many of these weapons are going to end up along the Mexican border, and the cartel drug clans are going to be using those against the American southern border of Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico. That's the new flashpoint that many in the military are looking at as a result of this war. And you'll see also those weapons being used in Europe as the European, governments begin to encounter more and more disruptions and revolutionary protests.
Okay, unfortunately, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, John Bostic in Belgrade, Scott Bennett in San Francisco.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching this episode of Spotlight. I've been your host, Behruz Najafi, and I'll see you next time.